The Norwegian Method.
I'm Olav Alexander Boo, peak human performance developer, coach to Christian Blumenfeld and Gustav Eden.
I'm Dr. David Lippman, a health and human performance specialist, and welcome to the Norwegian Method podcast.
The Norwegian Method.
Welcome back to the Norwegian Method podcast, and Olav is joining me today to talk about perhaps the thing he's most known for, lactate. Olav, welcome.
Thank you.
It's something that's almost synonymous with you, maybe synonymous with the boys to have bleeding earlobes. I think at one point I asked you how many lactate samples you taken, and I think the estimate was in the tens of thousands.
I can tell you, just in Sierra Nevada in May, we did 900 samples just in 1 month.
Yeah, so there you go. And however many months, times that by 12. And then by years, and we get to a man that's on a podcast talking about lactate. So I guess there's lots to unpack here, and this can get very deep very quickly. I think we'll try and keep it as high level as possible and make this accessible, because I think the people who are experts or who are maybe competent and confident with lactate may or may not pick some things up here. But I think there are a lot of people who are doing lactate who are maybe novices and could be helped a lot by us. So that's probably more who we're targeting. But, if there's some in-depth insights, we'll give those as well. Let's start at the beginning. What is lactate? Because I think people misunderstand this. Let's start there, and then we can go from there. I think it'll give us a good insight into the conversation.
Yeah, it's a molecule that is a result of the glycolysis. So when you break down glucose, it basically you release ATPs, which is really what your muscles are utilizing to do work. In the process, you produce also hydrogen ions. But when you split glucose and you produce ATP and the hydrogen ions, you are actually left with the first step is actually pyruvate. And pyruvate actually lacks one. There are two. So glucose is basically one glucose molecule broken down into two pyruvate molecules. Both of those two pyruvate molecules have actually room for one hydrogen molecule, hydrogen each. And then basically it can bind it, and that's how you form lactate. And then basically lactate can be reused. And there are actually, the muscles actually have a slightly higher affinity for lactate than what they actually do for glucose. So if both lactate and glucose is present to the muscle, it will actually prefer lactate over glucose.
Yeah, so far from a waste product. And I had someone say to me the other day, I can't believe people still have to caveat it and say that it's not a waste product. Like, unfortunately, that probably still exists in textbooks. It certainly exists in the popular understanding. So I wanted to be very clear and underscore here, not a waste product, certainly helpful.
I think it's even useful to say here that it makes no sense even to talk about waste products at all in the body, because the body, it's basically is a system that is highly fine-tuned to do work, and at the same time also making sure that we actually don't, let's say, to paint a little bit black and white, die along the process. So even the hydrogen ions, which we say, okay, this is what that starts to hinder the muscle to contract, or basically signaling for the muscles to contract. Basically, this is not really a waste product. It is there, and it is there because of something. And the reason for that is because you're actually now starting to redline. You're going too hard, and your body is not used to this. You're not trained to do this, or to go into that domain you're going into. And it's a way to avoid, for example, injuries or other things that are there as well. So talking about waste or waste product is a little bit of a strange thing. It's coming from a standpoint where one disregard and say something is really not useful in the body and so on. Everything here has a function, and it's just a matter of what kind of function it has. And then we can say, hey, I just want to have double my VO2 max tomorrow. Well, there are so many things in the body that needs to adapt to that. Not only your heart and your lungs and your mitochondria. There are many other functions. And then it actually helps to have these kind of functions, such as, for example, hydrogen ions, to avoid that somebody just installs a huge engine into your body and you don't have the other support structure around is not in place there. So all of this is such fine balance, and it's a matter of finding the right strategy to build this basically teeter tooter all the way up to where you want to go.
Yeah, I really like the perspective. It's a very well-evolved, efficient system. And to think of anything as wasteful or inefficient, it probably shows a lack of understanding on our part, not a poor design on the part of the body. So I think that's great. But so now we have lactate as a result of our glycolysis. What are some factors that will impact lactate, and in what way? So I'm thinking things like temperature, I'm thinking things like hydration and altitude, because I think this will give us insight into some challenges around measuring it and how we may use it.
Yeah. So this back to the previous episode, we talked about creating a substrate profile. So you basically go to laboratory and then you check for example, you use gas exchange to, for example, figure out how much carbs are you using at different intensities and so on to set, for example, a kind of fueling strategy and a pacing strategy with your substrate utilization in mind. And the thing is that lactate obviously is, or not obviously, but lactate is actually a really good tool, not only for intensity control, but it actually gives an indirect view into the glycolytic activity in the body. Like how much energy are you approximately getting from the glycolysis? You can do this, well, already just from a single sample, you can have already a little bit of a very, very coarse idea how much is coming from that. Is the lactate value high? Is it mid-range? Is it low? But you can't really know it 100%. Or let's say you will get, at the moment you do your second sample, this is where you get a more clearer picture of this. Is it steady state or is it unsteady state? For example, is it where basically for the same power output or same pace, do lactate actually increase, or actually is it stable, for example, which tells something about, which many people have tried to do in the past, and that's figure out where your threshold is by doing FTP test, critical power testing, all our time trials. There are many ways to do this, but the really good thing with lactate is that it allows us to get that kind of insight wherever we are almost in a session, but without going to all out. So we can see where energy is coming from. And very often also it's about understanding that there are some, let's say some overarching or let's say fundamental limitations to human performance. One of them is, for example, VO2 max, or basically how quickly are we able to turn around energy per time. We are not looking now at the long picture, so we just assume now that you have trained really well, consistently over a long, long time, and we are at the point where we're trying to optimize something. And then we can say that the energy turnover per time is going to be a limitation, so how much oxygen are you able to get into the system per time? And then the other part is basically how large are the resources. So then depending on your substrate profile now, how much energy is coming from fats, how much is coming from carbs. Basically, fats, we can say that that's almost an order of magnitude larger than your glycolytic capacity in the body. And I'm not talking about glycolytic power now, but capacity, so how much glycogen do you have available in your body. And the thing there also is that it's a little bit more complex than that as well when it comes to glycogen, because glycogens, there's a limited ability, at least from what we know in research, there's a limited ability to transport, to take, for example, glycogen that you have stored in your upper body to your lower body to do work, for example. So that means you are even more limited there in that aspect by that you only have glycogen available, or primarily only glycogen available in the muscles that is doing work, plus the liver. And again, going from there, that means that we know that, okay, the pace you're going to go in endurance events is going to, especially when it starts to get a little bit longer, is going to be highly limited by how much glycogen you have available in the body, combined with carbohydrate uptake, or basically oxidation as well, absorption and then oxidation of it. So lactate, what is it? To come to that, lactate is, as we just explained, it's basically a really good way to look at indirectly and indicatively on where does energy come from. But why we say indicatively is because it's not a volumetric or gravimetric measure of the glycolytic system. It's just an indicator that gives an indication of it, like SMO2, for example, muscle oxygen that you can measure with portable devices today, like, for example, the Moxy monitor. that device does not say anything about your VO2 max or how much oxygen you're using. It just says something about how much you're extracting of the oxygen is available to the body. And that means that two persons, one super fit, one unfit person, they can run at the same pace, but one have almost like he has very high concentration of oxygen in the muscles. The other one is almost to the point where he's at VO2 max, but you don't measure his VO2 max, but you can see that he's starting to get very low on oxygen concentration. Now, lactate is the same way. We don't know how much energy that comes from the glycolytic system because we don't measure it. We can try to model it, but again, we like to stick with first principles. But that means also that when we do this, we also have to be aware of a couple of things, and that's why what you asked about, like what influences lactate. So lactate is influenced obviously about intensity first and foremost. How hard are you going? Because that will dictate where the energy has to come from. And obviously, the harder you go, the higher you go towards the VO2 max, the more energy, and above even VO2 max, the more energy per time has to come from the glycolysis, meaning more lactate produced per time. The second part of it is that we then can look at on other factors that are influencing it. Where do we measure lactate? We don't actually measure lactate in the muscles where it is produced. We are measuring it in the bloodstream, which is a couple of steps downstream, actually. And this means, again, that we are not getting a reflection of the true lactate that is in the muscles. We get actually a dampened and delayed signal of that when we are measuring in the blood. But it's the gold standard, you could say, today that is utilized, and it's a very practical way of utilizing it as well. So what we do, what then you can say is you are measuring lactate now in the blood, then it's basically influenced by a couple of other things. Is, for example, it's influenced by your blood volume. So, for example, if you have a low blood volume, but let's say if you were able to talk now about volume of lactate in your body, so you had a certain volume. The lower the blood volume is, the higher the lactate concentration would be. This is like, to give a simple analogy, if you have available 1 deciliter of orange juice and you pour it into a 1 liter basin, obviously that's gonna be a much larger part, or let's say around 10%, and versus depending on which way you calculate it. But if you have now suddenly a 3 liter or 5 liter, for example, obviously it's going to make a much smaller fraction of that one. It's still the same amount of orange juice, or in this case, same amount of lactate that is being produced, but it's just a matter of how much space do you actually dilute this lactate into, which gives the concentration. And that's why this is not a volumetric or gravimetric measurement. It's like VO2 is a volumetric measurement. This is a concentration metric because we measure concentration in something, but we don't know the volume of it. Further, what we know the blood volume, which we are measuring the lactate, is again heavily influenced by hydration, and thus also this changes the hematocrit, and this can change quite significantly over a session. And when I say significantly, it's not unnatural for an athlete if they go out in the morning and they have a longer threshold session, for example, with some easy work as well. So let's say they do 2.5, 3 hours, but high intensity, or at least, well, let's say around LT2. The thing is that you can easily see a change there of an absolute change in hematocrit going from, let's say, from 45% to 55%. And we just be mindful about this, that in the old days, UCI, for example, used hematocrit to quantify whether people were potentially doped or not. Today, or let's say a couple of years ago, they moved away from it exactly because of this, because hematocrit is so heavily influenced, or your hydration is so heavily influenced by how much you're sweating and getting out of your body. Then I've even seen athletes go from 45 to above 60% in hematocrit in a single session on a day. So it just tells you how much. And what is then the consequence with lactate? Lactate will, of course, in these cases, for the same intensity, go up, because the amount of blood that you are, or let's say the amount of blood that the lactate now is diluted in when it is released out into the bloodstream is less than otherwise. So that's one. We know altitude will really not affect it directly. What it will indirectly affect it simply because there is less oxygen available. So if you go for the same absolute intensity, meaning either pace or power at altitude, since there is less oxygen available per liter of air up at altitude, it means that before you have adapted to altitude, you will normally rely more on the glycolytic system for the same pace of power output. And that allows you, of course, when using lactate altitude, to actually control your intensity rather from a metabolic perspective by using lactate. So you can say that we are targeting rather lactate when you go to altitude to keep the intensity consistent, for example. The other things affecting it, core temperature, as you get warmer, this will naturally actually increase also a little bit the lactate concentration. First, actually, it will drop it, simply because you're delivering energy more, or let's say at least aerobically, energy more efficiently to the muscles. So actually you can rely less on the glycolytic system. So lactic concentration will come down. Obviously you will get more as you go up in intensity. You will use more energy from both systems, but relatively speaking, you get less from the glycolytic system compared to the oxidative system. And that means also the lactic concentration can come down as this, but as core temperature actually start to continue to increase, where heat actually starts to become a little bit of a problem, you will actually start to see the opposite. Lactate will start to come up again. And this is something we can also reproduce, and we can actually quantify by using gas exchange as well. So if you measure, for example, VO2 and CO2, or VO2 and VCO2, you'll actually start to see that the RER value, the ratio between the two, actually also starts, or the RER value is actually coming up, meaning that more and more energy for the same effort is coming from the glycolytic system as well. Other things?
Carbohydrate availability is probably the other one. Is if you don't have the carbs to burn, you're not going to burn them. So
yeah, I think here this is a little bit of a more of a I would say that it's probably one of the, let's say, if I were trying to explain a low lactate production compared to what I would expect, one of them could be general carbohydrate availability, but on the other side also, we know that it's really hard to go that empty. That's actually started, that there are probably other reasons for it. More, for example, that can be coming back to, I don't like this. So it's because it's something that we can't directly, very easily, non-invasively or non-intrusively quantify, but you can. There also can say that if your type 2 fibers are more fatigued, you will also actually start to maybe see a lower lactate production, because the type 2 fibers are the ones that are dominant, or let's say predominantly the ones that are producing most lactate. It's compared to the type 1 fibers. Yeah. So both type 1 and type 2 fibers have oxidative capacity, but type 1 fibers obviously completely different magnitude compared to the type 2 fibers, but also on the opposite, basically type 2 fibers are able to produce much more lactate than your type 1 fibers. Yeah, but it's again something that I don't like to talk about, simply because it just becomes more like a theory or hypothesis or something that is really hard to prove. It's much better just to look at it from a first principle. What are you measuring? And then you have to put it into context. And in this case, if lactate is not able to come up, and compared to what you would expect, I would ask the athlete immediately, like, how do you feel? And in many of these cases, they would say, I feel a little bit tired. I'm not able to mobilize as much and so on, which can be an indicator of, for example, of a little bit too much training, too hard training earlier in the day or previous days or months or whatever, that is leading to a little bit more excessive fatigue. And of course, then it's important to be a little bit on guard. But it can also be then, normally you will also see that maybe heart rate also doesn't come as easily up anymore as well. So remember that a low heart rate for a certain power output is normally something you would consider as good, but there's a balance to all this before it also becomes bad too. Yeah.
That was exactly where I was going with lactate. Is aside from that situation, is there anything else where you would say low lactate for a given output is not good?
Yeah. Mostly I would say that it is another metric, or indicative, again, important to say, indicative metric of that potentially an athlete is, there can be reason for some, let's say, minor concerns there. Again, I would never make adjustments to a training program based on a single measurement, but if the athlete reports fatigue, heart rate seems to be a little bit suppressed, lactate is low, for example, compared to what you would expect for this kind of session, or it's trending this direction. And you can say normally that would be good, but combined with fatigue and other things, perceived fatigue and other things, then I would be cautious. And then on top of that, you also have those athletes that maybe are as well calibrated, say, no, I'm fine, no problem, because I'm able to do my training. Yeah, be a little bit careful around this, and of course, keeping track of these metrics, it allows you to build on a better and more systematic understanding of it. And that's why we for example, we built our own tool that actually, where we bring always in the measurement in, so we keep full track record of actually what is happening compared to what we are also expecting.
The Norwegian method.
The reason why I use Morten with the boys is because it reduces the GI stress. And the reason why it reduces the GI stress is basically because carbohydrates are packed in a hydrogel. And why that is important again is because if you can then take more carbohydrates per time, it means basically also you can train faster or race faster, which ultimately is the goal in our sport.
To benefit from the one-time code and get 20% off your next purchase on Morten.com, simply enter the code TNMS1 at checkout. The code is applicable once per customer on all products except the Morten bicarb system, valid until the 31st of December 2025.
The Norwegian method.
So you touched on a few things there that are important, and I'm going to ask a question off the back of this because it's like you read my notes before this, and I don't share my questions with you ahead of time, so it's particularly impressive in this context, or maybe we just think too similarly. But you talked about a couple of things there. You talked about another objective metric, right? So you have lactate, which is objective. You have heart rate, which is objective. We are controlling that or referencing that with respect to physiological output, so power or pace, right? And then we are calibrating that with perception, right? So now we have a sort of triangulation here of other things. Is there anything else you would bring aside from athlete type, which you talked about, personality type, which is, I can feel my body or I can't, or I want to do more training or I don't, that's sort of really important in coaching. That's the art of coaching. And then context in terms of, say, altitude or not altitude. Is there anything else you would bring in for context along with lactate and say this is really important in interpretation?
You could say that measuring hematocrit could, in sometimes, enrich a little bit it, but I'm also careful about recommending, because it becomes also noise at some point. So I would say that if you are on a journey and you want to understand a little bit better to make better decisions down the road, it's not like if you have access to it, but very often a good device for measuring hematocrit costs money. We have the same, actually the one we have used, the Nova Bio Lactate Plus for measuring the lactate, because it strikes a really good compromise between accuracy but also time from basic measurement to you get the results. And it has a large sample size, 0.7 microliters, compared to many of the other devices, which is 0.2, 0.3 microliters. But it gives the results very quickly and is calibrated towards a scale that we can use in other contexts as well. They also produce another device, which is called the It's called Nova Bio StatStrip Express or something like this, and it basically has the potential actually to measure both lactate, but those strips are very expensive because they are clinically or medically certified. No need to use them at all. I would stick still with the black one because the strips are so much cheaper, and then it can also measure hemoglobin concentration and hematocrit as well, and that can be useful to just have a box like this. Cost money. The machine is particularly expensive. I think it's more than €1,000 or 1,500 euros or something. It's quite expensive, but it's a useful device if you really want to develop it. But I would say that you don't also need it in that sense, because if you keep track a little bit of hydration, which an athlete should do, and yes, I've been hydrating well, or no, maybe I'm sweating a lot. Then you can say, okay, I'm hydrating well, but I'm sweating a lot. Okay, then at least you can put, okay, probably we don't say that, okay, you should do something as a consequence of the lactic concentration, but you keep that in mind and say, okay, how do you feel? Can you continue at this pace for the intent without going over the cliff towards the end of the session? Like, I would always use context and questions and discussing with the athlete to make to determine what to do. I would never rely solely on a metric just because it says something, because the thing that you don't want to do, knowing that you're also measuring on something that is heterogeneous, and that is the blood. Like, it's not like you have a uniform lactic concentration in your body in your body either. It will fluctuate a little bit, and especially before it reaches equilibrium. And then you can always ask, okay, what is there ever any equilibrium? Because at the moment, like, lactate will always fluctuate still a little bit depending on how you produce it and so. But I would say the most important metric in this context is that in this context, heart rate is an indicator. That's also not a gravimetric or volumetric measurement. Cardiac output is, but heart rate is not. Heart rate is just a function of cardiac output. We don't measure ejection fraction. We don't measure stroke volume. We only measure heart rate. So we don't know what the heart is actually doing beyond that. So we're making assumptions based on that. So that's why heart rate is an indicator or concentration metric, partial metric. Lactate concentration is a partial metric, concentration metric, or whatever one wants to call it. And that means that in this sense, you have one true volumetric measurement here, and that is actually power. That's one. But the other one that I would actually rely the most on here is that after I've been working a little bit with an athlete, I already know their face. I know how they normally are sounding on a session, how they're breathing, how they're working, how they're feeling, the smile, these kind of things. And if I see something here is confirming a little bit what I see on a lactate meter, for example, that is actually very important. I can actually say that a lot of people, when it comes to lactate measurements, I can say the most valuable thing that I do with lactate measurements is it allows me to step over to the athlete, grab them in the air. I'm this far away from their face. I can take the measurement, ask them, how do you feel? And I can look at them at the same time. I get the device. But I would say 90 or the largest portion of my information comes from purely that single question and the response, seeing the face, and then this becomes additional information that I can use to gauge the perception. If I think it's a true, or if I think it's a clean measurement. I'm also very quickly always to have additional strips with me. So at the moment I get something that actually I look like this is not, I getting out in new, clean it, make a new measurement immediately to have basically then a duplicate of it. What we have to remember is that because lactate is so heterogenic in our body, it will mean that you will never or almost never get two same identical measurement. But what you will already build a picture of is that if you're above LT2 or well above LT2, I should say, so let's say close to VO2 max, you will with two consecutive measurements see basically lactate come up even during rest, simply because that it hasn't reached equilibrium yet, so it will go up. If you're around LT2, then you will normally, or a little bit above LT2, you will normally see two equal measurements. If you are at LT2, you will normally see that it starts already to become a drop after 30 seconds. So if you do one measurement after 15, 20 seconds, 30 seconds, and then you do one extra one to duplicate, to check your measurement, that will already have dropped down. If you're at low intensity, well, then you will only get two low measurements. But the thing is that never trust your measurements so hard that you just say, okay, the device says this, it has to be this, I don't care what you say, go harder or slower, whatever it is there. If there is a discrepancy between what you perceive, what the athlete perceive, and what you get there, do another measurement. Don't blink at it, just do it immediately. And that's the best way of doing it. And if you don't have two measurements that are confirming high, okay, does that mean that then you should make a change to it? No, it's again context dependent. So we have to remember that all the information we're talking about there, and I know that a lot of listeners just wants to have like a magic trick here. Say, okay, if it says this, then do this. The reality is that it isn't like that. And that's the thing, as you venture longer into more measurements you do, whether it's being even power or VO2 max, so whatever you are measuring here, the world is very seldom black or white. It is always much more complicated. And that's the beauty of really coming to the point where you're trying to take an athlete from world class to world champion or whatever you are doing. The art, well, the reason why we still call it art is because it is inherently complex, and we have to just build our own filters to basically filter all this noise that is there and put it in there. Because very often noise is information as well, but it's making sense out of all this noise that is the trick moving forward. And that's when you start to realize as well that things are not black and white. 2.3 can mean much more than 2.3 or whatever that you are measuring on.
Yeah. I mean, again, you've read my notes here. What are some other mistakes that you think people make with lactate?
I think it's a very sensitive device, so be very careful with the device and especially the strips. That's one. Second part is what kind of lenses you're using. It's not don't use lenses made for glucose, simply because lenses that are made for glucose. So on these boxes, unfortunately, there are two mixed up metrics. One is an American unit, or basically imperial unit, and another one is a metric unit. The one that is American unit actually goes to the thickness of the needle, which is called gauge, and this has to do with the thickness of it. But the problem with this is that this is typically one of those sorry guys that are very true to the imperial system here. But the problem with gauge is that it's basically relative to something. So this is a metric, this is a number that is relative to something. And in this case, it means basically how much are you able to fit per area or per something. And in this case, when it's gauge, 28G, for example, which is glucose, is actually a thinner needle than a 25 or 23 or 21 or 19 and so on. And what we want to use for blood gas, including lactate, is 21G. 19G is getting a little bit too extreme. Then it will bleed unnecessarily much. Something we use in a couple of other settings. But for this purpose, you want to have 21G, not 23G, because basically here it is crap in is going to be crap out on your device. And if you don't ensure a good clean blood drop without having to squeeze or anything like this, you are already jeopardizing your measurement or influencing the measurement. And then basically what you get on the device, even if it's a non-contaminated measurement, it's not true to condition anymore. So use 21G lancets. That's very important. Doing them at a location where basically you very easily, you don't have to use force when you're getting out the blood. So very often when, for example, I think when people see us doing lactate measurement, it can look a little bit sometimes that we're really squeezing it. We're not at all. We basically are able to use the same even puncture for an hour, 2 hours without having to re-puncture. Because if you really find a good spot, it comes. The only thing we really have to do is to come up and just clean off the blood clot that is there, and then you just milk it out very, very easily. You get the blood drop out and you measure. But the thing is also here, again, to make sure that you get a good measurement, rather clean 3 times. Get out the blood drop, clean, get out the blood drop, clean, get out the blood drop, clean, and then do in the fourth one, then gambling on that the first one is going to be right because of contamination on things. And just to put it in perspective, 0.7 microliters of blood or 0.8 microliters of blood. And now even worse with the devices that collect 0.2 or 0.3 microliters of blood. If you think of how much, if you think of it, those times that you have done lactate measurement and you think about how small the blood drop is and how little of that blood drop that actually disappears into the strip, that tells you something about how little blood that actually is utilized. It's not like you have a big blood drop here hanging here and then it sucks everything of that in and you need to get out another one. It only takes a small fraction of the blood drop that is already out there. Now think about how little that is, and then think about how tiny does a sweat drop have to be before you're not able to detect it anymore. So if we said that was 0.05 microliters of size, that sweat drop. If it was 0.05 microliters, that sweat drop, that's already then more than 10% of the size of the sample that you're taking into your device. And it, depending then on how much the lactic concentration is in that sweat drop, that's going to have a massive influence on that measurement. Same thing with when cleaning. If you clean with water, it's the same thing. You're diluting now the lactate if you actually get water into it. So if you clean a lot here and a lot of water and you don't dry it off, you will actually get water into your blood drop now. And that's diluting down the lactate concentration. So you get a lower lactate concentration than what you actually are that is true to reality. So this is why lactate measurement is inherently susceptible to noise, contamination, errors, and this kind of thing. And it do require quite a lot of practice to get to the point where this gets really stable. And even then, I can say that I do sometimes out in with a new one just to check what the lactic concentration is there. And don't expect it to be the same. And that doesn't mean that now there is an error in your first measurement. It simply means that there are also kinetics involved here as well. So this is why this is inherently a complex measurement, but a very useful one if you master it. So if you do it, continue to do it. It's super valuable, but don't use it and expect the same accuracy or repeatability of it in the same way as a power meter on a bike, where we're talking a plus minus 1% accuracy, for example, or a heart rate monitor, where basically a heart rate is, or a beat is hopefully true to a real beat that is in your body. Here, we are measuring downstream. We're not measuring something that's happening in the muscles. It's influenced by a whole lot of factors, really. But that means also that when you have a lactate box as well, don't leave it open. Like, take out the strip you need. Don't touch the tip of the lancets. No, sorry, the tip of the capillary. Like, try to grab the strip in a way that you touch it on the middle where you don't have the sensor. Get it out into the device. Close your box immediately so that it doesn't get, let's say, humidity in there over time and all the things that potentially also starts to disrupt or change or drift. Or cause the strips to drift. The strips, most of these lactate meters, they use a technology which is called amperometric. Or it's an enzymatic amperometry. So basically, it's enzymes that react with the sample that comes in, that gives that is made to react with lactate in particular. So it won't react with other things, but that's one. And the second thing is that the amperometry, it means basically that you're sending electricity through there, and you're measuring the change in electricity as a function of that enzymatic reaction with lactate in there. And that means also that, again, this is something that is biologic, and biology is influenced by a whole lot of things as well. Don't leave your meter in the sun for that's going to make an influence to the measurements, the strips and the lactate meter in the sun. Don't leave it in sun. That's going to cause worst case drift to the measurement as well, because we are again talking about something that is an electric signal. If something comes heat on it, it's going to increase the resistance of the electric circuit, which again is also going to influence the measurement. So it's nice technology used right, but it's some technology that only should be used for information, not for dictation.
Yeah. Next question. Some myths and misconceptions you think that are common with folks? I mean, we talked a bit about waste products already and the lack of those. We talked about lower being better. It's not necessarily always the case. Is there anything else that you hear commonly, or common misunderstandings that you think, hey, let's spend some time on the podcast and write that, so that next time someone says it, you can say, hey, go listen to the podcast?
Yeah, I would say that delta are always the most important, not the lactate concentration itself. So basically what you're looking to inform yourself with, and that's why it's useful to do more measurements in a session, is that you basically are looking for, let's say that you want to change LT2. The point is, let's say that you have figured out at some test that their LT2 sits around 2.5 millimole. Be aware now, with all the things we have said, that this can change up and down a little bit from day to day and so on. There's a drift to it, and it's an even larger drift to it compared to power or let's say external metrics like power, pace, and so on. But if you found out that it was 2.5 or 2.7 or 3.2 or whatever it is for your athlete, or 4, I don't care really. But the point is that if you figure out what your lactate concentration sits around, where it goes from normally, so if you run on a treadmill or whatever in a controlled situation, or sit on a power meter with a bike with a power meter on a ergometer, and you do, then you can say that if you do consecutive intervals, same intensity, and you measure and lactate is stable, then you can say that either you're below or at LT2. Why you can't say that you are at LT2 or below LT2 is simply because you just see a steady state. You don't know how close you are to that unsteady state. That means that you actually now need to go up in power on the 2 next one to really verify, because the first interval, your lactate will normally go up, at least if you're properly warmed up and all these kind of things. So that's also just by that, when people start doing step protocols and they very often see there's a dip in lactate in the beginning there. So the first step lactate actually goes down. this is actually a consequence of, for example, that you're not properly warmed up, for example. So you are, relatively speaking, getting maybe a little bit more energy from your glycolytic system compared to the oxidative system, which can contribute to a higher lactate concentration. And as you get better warmed up, ventilation starts to come up, you're distributing, or you're delivering more efficiently oxygen out to the muscles. Lactate concentration, or basically the glycolytic system, the reliance on glycolysis, starts to go down, relatively speaking, compared to the oxidative system. But that's so basically what you see is can be a reflection of that. Can be. That's important to say, not necessarily always. But the same thing also when you're then doing, let's say you are properly warmed up, you are well into an interval, and you're doing this basically acyclic paired intervals where you do, for example, 2 equal, you go up in intensity, 2 more equal, and so on. Basically what we're looking for is basically not where, if you go up in intensity, that lactate goes up, because it will do. But it can inform you, depending on how much did you go up in power compared to how much did the lactate come up. And that can already inform you then what to expect from the next one. If it's a small jump up, you could probably expect it to be stable on the next one again. Maybe not, meaning that you're just slightly above. And now you know, okay, this is somewhere here in between. This is where LT2 sits for me, or MLS sits for this athlete. But if you have a small jump up and you then do another measurement, and then you see that it's still stable or sits within, let's say, it's stable, or maybe drop a little bit even as well, but it's the same, then you know, no, that was not LT2. And then maybe this is LT2, but you don't know before you then have done the next step again, and then you need to see, does it now go up or not? And this is what you really practice out in the field as well, and why we do so much measurements, because it allows us, or it informs us where basically the athletes are in let's say on the scale. Are they around LT2? Are they not? And so on. And this is also where you would say that at lower intensities you would normally expect you can do larger external or power changes, but with small changes in lactate. The closer you get to LT2 or above, obviously small changes can make a big difference in lactate.
The Norwegian method.
The reason why you want to have a VO2 master, because when athletes or customers comes there and they are doing the training, they're putting in money and hours into improving the fitness, you want to have a device that basically allows you to track their progress, but also measuring their metabolic power as well. And then on top of that, the only way to truly be able to do individualization is also to measure the utilization of the athletes. And there is probably no better device on the market to do that with than, for example, the VO2 Master.
If you've been thinking about adding VO2 testing to your training facility, you know our viewers get an exclusive one-on-one consultation with their product experts on how to make VO2 Master work for you. Head to vo2master.com/Norwegian-method to book yours today, or follow the link in our show notes.
The Norwegian method.
Yeah, and I think you do something that I think most good scientists would do, which is how do you feel, what's your RPE, etc. And the goal there is to start to triangulate both for you and the athlete. So what would be ideal is the athlete going, hey, I'm above. And then you take the measurement and that confirms it, right? You want them to dial in that feeling because that's the goal. You don't get to take lactate on race day. So you want them to understand where they are with respect to LT2 specifically in many cases. So you do want that insight from them as well so that you can triangulate, but also so that you can dial in their perception, right? You're giving them feedback on what the lactate is, not just, and on their physiology, so that hopefully their perception gets dialed in.
Yeah.
So we've already sort of started talking about this. Is that how you would create a lactate profile for an athlete? Doing those sort of steps, like bigger steps earlier, smaller steps around LT2, starting to understand lactate at VO2 max. And now you kind of have an understanding of general upper, lower, and middle bounds where they cross certain thresholds. Because, I mean, these thresholds are generally, we say LT for a reason. They are lactate thresholds, which is to say below LT1, things are pretty low and stable. They start to accumulate a little bit above that. And then above LT2, they start to accumulate at a quicker rate, right? There are 2 breakpoints basically in the curve. So is it that simple that you would take bigger steps earlier? Once you hit LT1, they're slightly smaller. Once you get above LT2, you may not take too many until you get towards closer to a VO2 max.
Actually, we have built a tool which we call actually in situ. Okay. You have obviously in vitro, in vivo, and all this, but in situ just means basically you're doing a measurement in the situation or out in the field. It comes from Latin, but and this is probably something we will release to the public so more people can utilize it at some point moving forward. But what we do is that we build dynamic curves. So you can say that I would, first of all, if you're going to do a step test in a laboratory setting or on an ergometer or whatever you do, I would normally advise using fixed steps. So, or they can be percentage based, or they can be absolute based. I would keep them percentage based simply to keep them relative to a person's physiology. If it's fixed, then basically it will be small steps for some people, huge steps for other people. So percentage wise, I would keep them then fixed. Normally, I would say sticking somewhere between 5 to 7%, depending on a little bit on what kind of athlete you have in let's say per step. And then I would say that one thing we also have to be mindful about is that LT2 is perhaps the only real, let's say kind of threshold. And what just to clear up that confusion, threshold is in its simplest sense, like in the same way that you go into a staircase, it's flat floor, and suddenly there's elevation change in your floor. That's a threshold. Or you come to a door and you have to step over that threshold that is there. And the threshold, let's say, term really just stems from that. What we see is that if you do a linear increase, for example, in power, for example, on a bike, or then basically the threshold is simply where you have a departure from that linearity, or let's say at least close to linearity. Let's say you have a curve linear, but you suddenly see there's a more of a larger, simply a larger departure, or you could say deflection or inflection point from that point. So we could also call this lactate inflection point too, and that would maybe clear up some confusions, because people think of it more like that you go from a clear condition to another condition. No, there is just that what is happening is that something starts to cost much more than what it did, let's say, relatively speaking, to the previous steps there. This is the same thing in a car. If you run a car, you will have a fairly linear increase in, for example, fuelage in a certain domain there. But before that domain, you actually start to use unreasonably much fuel compared to the distance you're using little, but but as you then go faster, you use a little bit more fuel, but at some point, going a little bit faster is going to increase the fuelage or fuel consumption radically or exponentially. This is no different from physiology. This is purely physics. It's really just physics. So, for example, for people that has an electrical car, let's say that you have an electrical car and then you drive on the road and you look at the range that you have available there. Drive at 60 kilometers per hour or at 60 kilometers per hour. Now, look what happened if you take your car up to 80 and 100 kilometers per hour, and you'll see that the range for your car is not the same anymore. Up to a certain point, you'll start to see that there's very little difference actually in the range of your car, whether you go 40 or whether you go 60 and maybe even 80 kilometers per hour. But suddenly when you come over a certain threshold, then suddenly you see that the range of the car drops significantly. And that's the same thing that is here as well, that when you go up in intensity, up in power, for example, you'll start to see that, yes, lactate comes up as well, but suddenly there is a more rapid departure from that linearity increase in power output, which is what we normally call a threshold, or better maybe said inflection point, or inflection point, for example. LT1 is actually more of an artifact of the method we are using. So the reason for why you are able to detect LT1 has more to do with the weakness in the measurement method than it really is a reality. And that is because if you had been measuring lactate in the muscle itself, or even you can do this exercise yourself, you can even take your vastus lateralis, set your biking. If you actually, instead of pinching your finger or your earlobe, actually do a puncture, actually make the same lancet, put it on your vastus lateralis and put it there, you will actually start to see that this is happening at a much lower intensity already, this inflection point that is that. But the problem has to do that lactate meters are measuring in the blood, which is a dampened and delayed signal compared to what is happening in the muscles. And that's why it looks like you can have big jumps in basically power output, and there is no change in lactate, and then suddenly it starts to become a change there. In reality, this is already changing in the muscle from rest and up throughout the whole spectrum of intensity. And that's why that LT1 is something that we have to be much more careful about saying something very hard about when we use lactate, because it's much more influenced by everything from your metabolism at that day, for example, core temperature, timing of the day, which also actually applies to LT2. And actually one thing that we didn't mention, the timing of the day you are measuring will actually have a significant impact on lactate production.
Will it be lower or higher in the day?
So basically in the morning is where you would normally see higher for the same pace or power. Later in the day, it will be lower for the same pace and power.
The lactate will be lower or higher with respect to the same power. So the break point will therefore be lower or higher.
That the breakpoint will actually also then be lower, or no, value will be low, but basically it will look like you're fitter in the afternoon than what you are in the morning. And this is actually true for endurance sports. And the reason for that has to do also with the circadian rhythm, your core body temperature, and that we know that basically the body actually will deliver energy more efficiently later in the day than it will be doing earlier in the day.
We were talking about dampening effects. So just to clear things up for people, lactate is produced in the muscle. It gets recycled locally. And then at a certain point, we overwhelm that ability. That is then transported in the blood. That's where we start to see LT1, roughly, right? That is then, again, dampened by the blood because it dilutes in the blood. And as it accumulates more and more, we start to overwhelm our body's ability to use that lactate and starts to accumulate more and more and more, right? Because lactate can be used by other muscles, the brain, et cetera, et cetera. So just to clarify that with people. But I think that's super helpful for people. A couple of little things here I wanted to clear up before we finished up. How do you use lactate for intensity control? You've already talked about things are relative. You're talking about dissociation between work and lactates being an indication of breakpoints and turn points. So when it comes to intensity control, I'm anticipating you using lactate in a couple of ways. One way is to ensure that somebody is below LT1 on easy sessions, right? And so you would be looking at having a good insight into what LT1 looks like for them, roughly what those measures are, and keeping them relatively controlled below that. Now, how close you get to that probably is a function of how comfortable you are with your measurement technique and that athlete and their ability to feel LT1. And then I assume on LT2 sessions, or if you're trying to go between thresholds, you're trying to ensure that they're there. And when it comes to LT2 sessions or above LT2, I don't think there's too much lactate measurement, but please correct me if I'm wrong here.
Yeah, we actually use the lactate across all sessions, everything from even sprint sessions, VO2 max sessions, LT2 sessions, LT1 sessions, and below. And the reason for that is, again, that we always have to be mindful about, let's say, pacing strategies limited by fueling. And then we want to understand what is also going on in the body as well as a function of the intensity that we are doing. But you can say that on the sprint session or high intensity sessions, obviously you will not have a very high lactate value at all, simply because the duration you're doing the very high effort is so short that you won't see a very high lactate value. But if you divide it by time, then you will see that the increase in lactate per time obviously is very high. So the signal is low, but let's say the change is large relative to time speaking. VO2 max, there you will see very high lactate values, but it's not necessarily so much about controlling the intensity, rather maybe for smaller adjustments depending on other factors as well. But it's where you want to see that, for example, towards the end of the session, when you've done the session, you are maybe wanting to see that you are within a range, rather, I would say. And if you start to see this is getting more and more suppressed, then you have to start to think about the consequences of it. Is it really the utilization that you want to have up, or is it actually the glycolytic system you want to make more powerful, for example? Then on the LT2 sessions, Here it simply is about dialing in the intensity for the athlete so that we stay approximately where we want to be. LT1 sessions, it's more or less the same as well, because LT1 sessions is, you can say LT2 sessions is a session where you can in a fairly short time go close to exhaustion and depletion. Like true depletion, that's not what you're talking about, but getting close to depletion. LT1 sessions, actually also you use lactate, you use a lot of carbohydrates. So when people talk about fat max is something that I would almost argue that most people misunderstand a little bit. And that is that even at fat max, you use a lot of carbs. And very powerful athletes, like for example, the guys sitting in Tour de France, they are using a lot of carbs at fat max. But the point is only that it's a very, very, let's say, now we can use the word economy, which we discussed in the previous episode, but fuel economically, it's a very ideal point to stay close to, for example, because it allows you to obviously go very fast but rely on a very sustainable fuel source. But you will use a lot of carbs. And I can already tell you that for people that thinks that LT1 or fat max, but let's say use LT1 since we are using that out in the field, people that think that you can go at LT1 forever, that's not true. The problem is you are actually limited by how much carb you are able to take in at LT1. So even at LT1, you can deplete yourself easily, even by eating high amounts of carbs. So even if you fueled, like if you put in 100, or let's say 200 grams, or let's say 150 grams of carbs per hour, if you're raising the same LT1 as Christian, or let's say you're going at the same power output as Christian, for example, the problem with that is that you're already using so much carbs at LT1 that you're not able to keep your glycogen availability in balance anymore. You will deplete it because you are using carb at a faster rate, even at LT1, than what you're able to resupply by eating 150 grams of carb per hour. That's why you can't race at LT1. For Christian, he can't race at LT1. He actually have to race at a fraction of LT1 to be able to come off the bike and then run the pace that he does there as well. This is something that most people actually don't think about. But the fact is that at LT1, still the carbohydrate utilization is relatively speaking low compared to fat, but it's still so high that you're turning over much more than 150 grams per hour.
Well, that's because his power output's big, right? This is what people misunderstand about relative versus absolute intensities.
Yes.
Even at an easy relative intensity for him, his carbohydrate burn is still going to be significant because his power output is so much. Even if it's 5%, 5% of a huge number is a big number.
Yeah, and even if the lactate is still low, very low, so let's say it's 1 or even 0.8, 0.9, the problem is that we have already talked about what lactate is a function of and how it is measured, and that is downstream, it's diluted and so on. But the thing is that one way we can quantify this is that by actually when we have done multi-hour testing, 8-hour protocols for basically looking at what is happening with, for example, gas exchange, you will see that the volume of carbon dioxide relatively to oxygen, you basically see there that carbohydrate turnover is still significant with a low lactate value as well. Even at fat max, this is the case. And that's the thing that it coming back to, I think it was the last episode we talked about it, but it's this context awareness, first principle, what are we trying to understand, and so on. And the problem is that the moment you start to model something, or you're moving away or using some fancy tools, the problem is that you're already, worst case, making the wrong interpretations because you're not really measuring what matters as directly as possible. First order, first principle. That's yeah.
So just to be very clear for people so they understand some of the context around what you said, when you talk about an LT2 session, you're talking about just below LT2, ideally. That's the goal, is to be in and around it, but a little bit below it, not a little bit above it. Is that fair, or are you looking the other way?
No, I would say that, again, I think when the trick is here is that it sounds like all these things comes with time. So practice, like over a long time. Because you can imagine for somebody get introduced to this the first time, that thinking, oh shit, this is so much information. Like, okay, I want to do this. So if I can do this, then this will be perfect. The fact is that no. think about all the things we have talked about in all the different episodes we have. Like, we started with one thing, and then when we really mastered it, we really focused on it a long time, and it became second nature to us to do that. Everything was automated. You just have a feeling, intuition for it, because you have so much experience. That's the time when you introduce thing number 2, and then you do the same, and then you introduce thing number 3. But at some point, this is like a puzzle piece where you're putting things in, and picture starts to form itself inside this puzzle, and you start to see a larger picture of this and how this has to be balanced. And that's the same thing here as well. I would like saying that being just below, being at or at LT2 is depending on context and the need that you're working on. One thing that one have to be cautious about, and just to add to that complexity there, and then think about it, this is something that you can't read in a textbook. It comes from basically years, decade of experience. And that is that, for example, if you basically have built a workout model system, so let's say you have a periodization, you have workout models that you have with intensities on this in a microcycle, and you are used to use FTP or critical power, and suddenly you decide, now I'm going to use LT2 instead as a surrogate for my CP or FTP, your system will fail. Why? Because LT2 sits at a lower intensity than your critical power FTP. And that means that if you downshift now the intensity that you are going to apply for the same sessions you did before that has a certain duration, the problem is that the stimulus is going to be different. Ultimately, stimulus is purely physics, is kilojoules. We can talk about ATPs and all these kind of things that we can't measure. But first principle, what we can measure, kilojoules. Kilojoules is a perfect substitute for stimulus. But what it does say is what we stimulate. And that's, of course, what it helps to say, put a range and say, okay, this is the range that you basically can stay within. And then you have an idea, like we talked about the profile in the previous, I think it was in the previous episode where we talked about how does metabolic measurement translate into a power curve, different kinds of power curves. But the point is that this just start with one thing. Like if you like our episode and you really like what we do and you're fascinated, inspired about it, my advice would be pick one of these things, do it really, really well. Because what you also do at the same time is that you also improve your efficiency of adopting things into your system as well. And when you really master it and you really see that this is you're doing good, that's the time and it's just second nature. Just do it. You don't have to think a lot. You do it like a snap. You see the athlete, you know the context, you know when to do this. That's the time when you do the next thing and you introduce that. But after a while, when you have done enough of these kind of things and you introduce it, this is where this really starts to paint a little bit bigger picture. Because a human is not lactate, for example, just to put it black and white again. It's just a tiny, tiny thing there. And we also have to be mindful about, you said, okay, maybe I'm most known for lactate. But I want to say also that for me, all this data that we are gathering, that is maybe very fascinating for a lot of people. But I can also say that my emphasis on data versus context and a person is not factors, but this is probably where I would say almost an order of magnitude more on context and human than it is on the data. But we still capture a lot of data. So then you can just imagine how much we emphasize context and human actually instead. So where do we stay at LT2? Do we stay just below? Do we stay at? Do we go even above, for example? It depends. For Christian and Gustav, I can say, when we have been out on a session, I know I've said to Christian, for example, continue the way he does. For Kasper, I've said go a little bit higher on the session towards the end because I know he needs a little bit more of that. Gustav, I said, we're just going to make, towards the end of the session here, I want actually to bring you closer to the depletion today than I want with the others, and we are going to make your intervals longer. So we're going to make progressively longer intervals exactly to provide a larger stimulus around LT2 for him. So it is context dependent, person context dependent where we will go. I would never dictate and just say, okay, this is the program, go do this, and then you have a world champion in a year's time. I can guarantee you it will fail.
It's something I try to bring across in the first series is how person driven you were. I don't think it landed for people because I think people are interested in the things that they can do quickly and easily, right? Maybe that's why they're listening and trying to learn those things from you. Maybe they already know the other stuff, but it is something I try to bring. The last thing I wanted to just get some clarity on before we finish up this episode is your procedure. Now, you've already mentioned things like good gauge of needle. You've talked about cleaning the site. You talked about not using water. What do you use to clean?
Oh no, water is perfect, but you just have to dry it properly. You just have to make sure you properly dry it before. Water is perfect. I would say that arguably, but don't use a tissue, don't use a towel, because a towel will start to get contaminated. So use paper tissue. Paper tissue, clean off with water is perfect, but then you also have to use a dry paper tissue as well to really dry it off as well, because you don't want water contamination. It might sound strange, but water is contamination in blood when you're measuring in whole blood to get a lactate concentration. So it just needs to. So water is perfect. It's really, really perfect to use. I would not use alcohol swabs or anything like this. I would use pure water, not from a bottle that you're drinking from, pure water, and then basically like bottled still water and paper tissue. Perfect. But make sure always when you have cleaned with water, you have to dry it.
Yeah, so maybe a better word than contamination is dilution. So you don't want to dilute it with anything, be that sweat or water. And then get your sample. If you need to take a second one, take a second one. Don't be scared. Be careful about the amount of air that gets into your lactate strips. Be careful how you handle the lactate strips. Be careful where you keep the lactate meter and strips, and practice.
Good one. And actually, that's one I forgot to mention. And that is actually don't double dip. You need to keep the lactate meters and do one sip. You cannot do a half sip and then by accident you get it away and then you fill up the rest afterwards. Immediately throw the strip. Don't wait for the result even. Just get in another strip and do one. It has to be one single sip, and don't get the strip touching the air or the puncture site. It should always be the puncture site, a blood drop, and then the strip comes close to there. And this is again a piece of practice. How I normally do it is I always support my device in one hand, I hold in the other, and then I actually support my hand on the other hand there. Because if an athlete move now, my hand actually follow with the meter. Instead of that, you do like this and something like this, and then the athlete move, and suddenly you have this case of where you get air inside the sample. So actually good you bring up, because that's something I see quite often. And that is that they actually, and also the same thing with the puncture. If you don't get very easily blood out, puncture again. Don't bother and spend time on making, squeezing and trying to get out the blood. If it doesn't come out very easily, do it again until you master it.
Yeah, and for completeness, to finish off, the finger and the earlobe are different. If you can only do finger, you can do finger. That's fine. If you can only do earlobe, that's fine. But understand that if you take a measure concurrently with the same meter somehow on the two sites, they will look slightly different, and that's okay. So probably the best advice is don't switch between the two within a session. It's probably not the right way to do it.
I think for athletes, use your fingertip, because that's just the easiest and most consistent for you to do. If you have a coach, just be mindful that there is an offset between the finger and the earlobe, and it will also depend on modality.
Yep, perfect. I mean, that's been great, Olav. I've learned a lot. I'm sure listeners have learned a lot. I'm sure this is going to be very well listened to. So for those who have listened and think someone else will gain value from it, please do share the episode with somebody. Please rate the podcast. We do appreciate that. And subscribe if you haven't yet. There is video versions of this that might be Spotify, if you are there. Otherwise, it's on YouTube because there's some visual aspects that Olav's given us today, particularly around technique towards the end here. So feel free to go watch them as well. Olav, thank you so much for this. This has been great.
Thank you.
And we'll see you next time.
The Norwegian method.